And we're back in the Gunners Club.
And you're here, of course, with Gunner, myself, and with Seuss. And it's been such a long time since I've come out of the cinema thinking, wow, this is it. This is a great film. This is exactly the way that I would make the film if I could make it. We're talking, of course, about the new Bob Dylan biopic. You a fan of Bob Dylan?
I am a fine fan of Bob Dylan. I was very much of a fan of his, this genre and the type of songs that came out in the Vietnam War era. It was just something that you could relate to and sing along to and heard over and over again.
If you love music, this is the film for you because it's very faithful for talking about the story of how we got this Americana form of music that really started with Woody Guthrie, and you could say the heart line went through to Pete Seeger, through to Bob Dylan, and I guess through to things like Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen today.
Yeah, that's right.
If you love that sort of music, I really recommend you see it. For me, it was visceral. The background of it was the youth of a young Bob Zimmerman looking for a new identity to forge himself as not only a performer, but a songwriter, someone who would write and create a new fusion of this music. Around the 50s and the 60s, folk music started to come into its own. You had depression economically, which was driving people out from the south towards the north. And with that, they were bringing their music with them. Now, even these people who didn't move out, they were able to listen in bed late at night, as Bob Dylan did, the music bouncing off the ionosphere from several states away, and be infused with this sort of music. Stuff like Woody Guthrie, where a man who would tell a lament, he'd tell a tale, he'd have something to say. And really what it took for a young Bob Zimmerman was to listen to the music from a black artist, Odetta, redoing her version of a slave song, essentially. And that was enough for him to exchange his electric guitar and to trade in for a Gibson flat-top guitar. And my God, when he started to write, didn't he change music forever?
Oh, he wasn't a music writer. He wasn't a musician. He was a poet. He was a songwriting poet.
Putting it into perspective, the only songwriter in the history of mankind to have won a Nobel Prize for Literature. I mean, that is astonishing. And the Nobel committee cited some of the songs like Blowing in the Wind because it's not about the song. If you stand on your head and squint sideways, effectively it's an Odetta song that she recovered. But the lyrics behind it, now, it's not too personal, these lyrics, and Bob Dylan was always discreet with the way that he'd write. So you could take that song and embrace it as part of the movement that you're supporting or you're following, or it could be adapted to social unrest at that time. But you don't know for sure that that's what he was writing about.
I would class him equal to, if not better, than Paul Simon.
That's very interesting. It's hard to compare the two. For a start, I guess because Paul Simon was so famous through the duo, him together with Garfunkel.
That's right.
But then separately, I have more keenly followed Paul Simon's career outside, in fact, of Simon and Garfunkel.
I'm talking about the poetic genius in the way they formulate these songs. And both of them had this way of making a song, well, into a folk song, if you want to call it.
Yeah, so let's talk really briefly about folk. So folk music, you could say, was an invention. Folk is about the people. And Pete Seeger features really heavily in this film. We see a very early Bob Dylan, and he's hitching a ride, and he's writing song lyrics in the back of the car. And we see him pull up in New York. We understand that he's just come from Minnesota, and he's got a mission in mind, and that is to tap into the source, to meet Woody Guthrie, who we understand is in hospital and suffering a neurological condition. He arrives, and who happens to be at his bedside but the cultivator, the preserver, the archivist of all sorts of folk music, Mr. Pete Seeger. I love Pete Seeger. He's a banjo player. I'm a banjo player. And he cultivated and he developed and he sold this music to the young people. It was him who was responsible for things like the Newport Folk Festival. But all this sort of music, it drew from things like what we call roots music today. At that time, if you sang a song, it didn't have to be classed as country. It didn't have to be jazz. It didn't have to be early rock and roll. It didn't have to be blues. It was simply music. It was roots music.
Yep.
And so a young Bob Dylan pulled up at the bedside in hospital of Woody Guthrie and sang a song to him. Now, if you've ever heard the first Bob Dylan album called Bob Dylan, he managed to get 2 of his own songs on the album, and one of them is that very song that he wrote for Woody Guthrie, Hey Woody Guthrie, I Sing You a Song. The tail end of that song is enough to send chills on my arms. It's just fantastic, the alliteration and just the feeling of staccato in his voice. The way that he employed his voice, and let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's face it, he's not a great singer. He's got a great affectation, but by clenching his teeth and singing through his throat and through his nose at the same time, he's managing to achieve a staccato, similar to what you'd talk about in hip-hop music today.
Very unique is what it is.
Now, let's not be pretty about genres of music, because he certainly wasn't. He could turn from acoustic music to electric music. He could turn from clenching his teeth and singing through his nose to singing with an almost normal voice, depending on how he decided to play at the time. If you don't believe me, do yourself a favour and have a look at the Skyline album that he's done. You'd be very surprised. He's actually singing with a non-affected voice, effectively doing country rock music. It's a great start to the film, though, having him there with Pete Seeger and with Woody Guthrie, because you've got those 2 central figures, and you can see with his youth and his natural talent, when he sings that song, Pete Seeger's jaw just literally drops, and Woody Guthrie, although spasmodic with his disease, reacts really keenly to it. And in the cinema, I could feel my heart racing and doing the exact same thing. And we get to see a young Bob Dylan get on stage at some of the small cafes, nightclubs, and we meet a young Joan Baez, who I know you like.
Yes, I do actually, yes.
She's perfectly cast by Monica Barbaro, who's got an almost too pretty voice. That's exactly how I'd describe Joan Baez's voice as well.
She was an excellent country music star, and to this day I still play her music. People call me an old fogey, but I still like that era of country music as opposed to the modern country music now.
Yeah, it's a little bit too country industry, I think, the music today.
Yes, that's correct.
So the Nashville Skyline album he did in 1969, it's the one where you see him tipping his hat to the camera. I think that's very similar to the country rock music, which I like, stuff like Mike Nesmith.
Oh, yes.
You know, first and second national bands, that sort of stuff. Brilliant for me, because you've still got that feeling of roots music in it. We see Bob Dylan develop, and we see him on the stage and playing to increasingly larger numbers of people. We see him as well swap his acoustic guitar for an electric guitar. Now, this brought a real cry against him. Some people yelling at him that he was a Judas, that he betrayed folk music in 1965. He got on stage at the Newport Folk Festival with the band called the Hawks, that later on became known as the Band. Everyone's heard of the Band as being the band that plays with Bob Dylan. Played only a few numbers and decided that he was going to walk up off stage. Straight after that, his contract had been fulfilled. He was pretty much turned around by the shoulders by Johnny Cash, presented Johnny Cash's guitar acoustic to get back on stage, placate them with one acoustic number before calling it a day there. What did he do to music, though? Did he betray it? Was it the downfall of folk music in 1965 when he did it? Well, a week later, Highway 51 Revisited came out, was number 1 in the charts everywhere. Like a Rolling Stone, you would have heard that song for sure.
Yep.
Changed music. Was it rock and roll? Was it folk? Could it be folk if it's acoustic or if it's electric? Well, I think it can, because Pete Seeger was always talking about democratizing music, meaning thrusting a guitar or an instrument in every person's hand and saying, you can sing, you can play, even if you can't do it very well, you can get together with your friends and do that. And in the case of Bob Dylan, he wasn't a great harmonica player. He was perfunctory, let's say that.
Yeah.
He wasn't a great guitarist. He could carry a tune with his voice, but only just. But he actually was able to write the songs. Instead of drawing back from the well of folk music that other people had written, he actually advanced that by drawing on the inspiration instead of the very words and writing his own music.
But here is where, maybe it's me, but I get confused. What is the difference between, I understand folk music, and a ballad? They're very similar. they're both country oriented. They're both, like, I mean,
A ballad doesn't have to be. For example, in theatre, rock and roll, bands like Kiss will sing ballads.
but I would have thought that the ballad, I mean, the epitome of a group doing a ballad would be Peter, Paul and Mary. In their, I'm talking in their day, right?
Yeah.
So how does that come together with folk music?
Very, very, very well. So Peter, Paul and Mary were always considered as folk music. But you see, there was a lot of what they called ethno-bias, and what ethno just from people. They thought that Pete Seeger classified people who lived in the regions and created the music there, let's say from Appalachia, for example, that they were the masters of that very particular form of music that they did. The problem was that form of music was so incredibly
niche,
defined and niche, that no one else could play it or would play it. If you tried to play it, you wouldn't be as good as them. It didn't necessarily have the audience. And then they were defined as the purists. The semi-purists were defined as artists like Joan Baez.
Yes.
And that she could take that, affect probably a more gentle voice to it and bring it to a market. And then those which were almost shunned within that cliquey folk industry, like Peter, Paul and Mary. And they say, well, even the name of Peter was false. So that's how artificial actually the music was. Sure enough, they were adopting songs which were folk music. And more, the songs which were being adopted were the songs that Bob Dylan actually wrote. For example, I got into Bob Dylan by buying every single album the Byrds had ever done.
Yep. That in itself is a legendary band, the Byrds.
Yeah. And if you go onto bands like Crosby, Stills and Nash, after the Byrds, great music of the time. Go and see the film. They really faithfully reproduce what the early 60s looked like, down to the costumes, the cars. I mean, just the cars themselves is worth the entrance price for me. That feeling that you get when you're in the small, intimate clubs and then when you're at the folk festivals and the stadiums. And when you're hearing for the first time these songs, can you imagine if some of these songs, like a Rolling Stone, for example, came out on stage and you'd never heard that in your life, and you've got a young person in his early 20s playing it who actually wrote it? For me, I can't quite grasp it, but through the film I just about can.
Well, it's almost going down memory lane with this nostalgia for old school music, if you like, back when you could still hear and understand the lyrics.
And the lyrics were worth listening to
well. Isn't that the truth? Hey?
Do yourself a favour, make sure you get yourself a ticket, go along and see it, and keep watching Sociology.
Is that out now?
It is.
Got my thumbs up. Catch you on the next one, guys.